Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we continue our exploration of Whitney Webb's masterwork, the two-volume One Nation Under Blackmail. We had some technical difficulties a couple of days ago when we tried to start the program, but I think we've rectified everything. Zoom has just come up with a new upgrade, and sometimes Zoom happens, as they say. And so we want to dive right in, and there's a lot of material to discover about this very complex domain of what has been called the deep state, what has been called the legacy group, what has been called the military industrial pharmaceutical complex. There are many names for a miasm that has been infecting the US government and governments around the world really since the end of the Second World War. I mentioned in my original introduction something that's worth just noting as we engage in this very complex and deeply unsettling bits of information. If you look at the United States in the Middle East, you'll see that the Biden administration, even though it knows that its continued support for Israel's genocide in Gaza is eroding public support, progressive support in the United States, and is jeopardizing Joe Biden's possibilities for re-election. Nevertheless, the forces for war are stronger than the president. We see that day by day, most recently over the last couple of days in the request of the special prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to have indictments for war crimes and crimes against humanity against Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister Gallant, as well as three leaders of Hamas, rather than taking that in and in any way reflecting on whether the United States should modify its policy. Instead, the Biden administration is working with the Republicans and Democrats in the Congress to now impose sanctions against the special prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who happens to be a very highly respected legal scholar in the UK. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. Similarly, I mentioned in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are being routed. They're being slaughtered at the rate of about 1,000 killed and wounded every 24 hours. The Russians are moving forward across the entire front line, moving west toward the Dnieper River. There is offer by the Russians to negotiate, and rather than engage in a ceasefire and negotiations, President Zelensky of Ukraine, and who has just sent a major delegation to Washington, which is here right now, want to escalate. They now want weapons that can attack into the heart of Russia, and they want U.S. special forces now to go into Ukraine in addition to the special forces that are already there. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Brown, almost with a sigh, 2 days ago said, well, yes, probably the introduction of more U.S. special forces into the war in Ukraine is inevitable, he said. And if you remember the Vietnam War and other wars that the United States has fought, where it got increasingly embroiled in the tar pit of a particular region, it always starts with military aid and then sending special advisors, special forces. So this inability of the political class in the United States, and I would add the G7 and in Europe, to in any way step back, consider the strategic catastrophe in which they find themselves, do the obvious, and that is a ceasefire in negotiations. Instead, it's as if they're sleepwalking inside a momentum that is bigger than they are and over which they have less and less control. It's an extraordinary phenomenon that the President of the United States is being revealed to be as powerless as he is in the face of geostrategic realities that, if not dealt with wisely, will hasten the demise of the United States itself as the premier power around the world. And so we want to start today where we wanted to start yesterday, because we wanted to get to a PowerPoint and start to just systematically lay out some of the bits of evidence that are beginning to surface about how this cancer at the heart of the American polity was formed, how it's grown, and how it is operating in today's world. And in order to lead us through that, we're very honored to have Linda White, one of our graduate students at Ubiquity University, whose PhD dissertation to some degree touches on some of these matters due to her own personal experience, which she shared last time. So Linda, I want to welcome you to our program, and Georg is on standby, so we're going to make sure that the technology works today, and then we'll just move through this presentation with one or two to follow over the next several weeks. So Linda, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jim. And I really appreciate you bringing the current events to this, because it really, as we get into this today, this is it's even more than 100-year story that leads up to this. So I am going to do my screen share, and just so the audience knows, I did have a lot of videos that I'm not going to play, but I may be able to put them in the chat for the after chat as relevant. So let's see, hopefully everything will go, and then I hit play. Okay, Georg, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Just I think you have to hit right a bit higher on the actual button there.
Okay, this is what I ran into last week. Is the black line is okay. I'm going to leave the meeting. It says okay. So there we go. It asked me to leave the meeting to get here, and last time I was hesitant. So thank you. Okay, so today, if you weren't here last Tuesday, the intention was to do volume 1, but because of technical difficulties, we didn't get that far. So today is volume 1, and we're going to go begin with what is known as the underworld, and it starts on the New York waterfront, and then from there we're going to go to China and the opium trade there. And that's the beginning of between New York and then also the China opium trade was really the beginning of intelligence and organized crime. From there, we're going to come back to the US and Canada during Prohibition and look at the relationship between Prohibition and organized crime. And what's important to remember is that throughout all of this, I think this is where it gets really confusing and complicated, is legitimate business. And so we have the national security state, we have organized crime, and then we have big business. So that's what I'll be laying out in the beginning. Then there's a man, Roy Cohn, that we'll get into his background a little bit. He was a mentor for Donald Trump, and that kind of brings us up to present day. what's happening with our politics. And then the chapter Shades of Gray, is really showing these overlaps. And then I'll go a little bit into the private CIA. I also just wanted to say a little bit about secrecy because, this presentation is really the dark side, the shadow side of secrecy. But really my passion is the recovery of truth from within the shadow of secrecy. And, there's important value to national security clearances, and that's what I shared on Tuesday. I was born into that world and it didn't seem dark at all. Then it, did become dark and, I've spent the rest of my life, unpacking that. But the actual intention, behind national security clearances is for the greater good. I've also spent, over 40 years in the therapy realm where confidentiality is very important, as a sacred container. And then the anonymity of the anonymous recovery programs. Craig Hamilton, he teaches about evolutionary conversations and there's transparent communication and the mystery schools, the mystery schools, there was secrecy to protect the initiates. So I think what's important here is what I'm getting into is the lack of an ethical code and a moral imperative based on a quest for power, control, and how it's gotten out of control. And so we're going to look at a very convoluted and complex world of intelligence, organized crime, and legitimate businesses. And I'm particularly going to focus on banking, healthcare, and technology. We won't get to technology today. That's a really big issue, but we'll get into that. And then how that got intermingled with financial crimes, political corruption, fake news, and what we're now calling transhumanism or AI. So the international banks and the 2008 economic crash, here's the past and the present. I'm not going to go into this today other than to say, $21 trillion is unaccounted for within the Pentagon budget. And so we'll see where some of that money might have gone. So Jeffrey Epstein, the big question is, was it suicide or was it murder? He was originally arrested in 2007 in Florida and again on July 6th, 2019 in New York. And he died in August of 2019 in New York prison. He worked as a financial bounty hunter and he helped recover and hide stolen money for powerful people. He was charged with pedophilia and sex trafficking. He had a working knowledge of front companies, offshore banking, and other financial webs. And the questions, that remain is, why was he so heavily protected from justice for decades? How did he earn his money and accrue such an extensive power list of connection? Was his life part of a conspiratorial coup? And Georg, I'm going to have to ask you, there's things covering my screen here, and I'm just wondering if I can get them out of the way. Well, anyway, so the scope of the enterprise, it's a global network of covert criminal activity mingled with the intelligence apparatus and legitimate businesses. And it had to do with prohibition, the global drug trade, sexual blackmail, the global arms race, drugs, LSD, and the CIA, real estate development, the global banking industry, and then the CIA air transport. And again, I can't see this on my screen, it's covered up, but it culminated in
sorry, Linda, what do you see that's covering it? We see it perfectly fine. There is a white box or something.
I've got a bar, that's about mute, chat. It's the share screen, and I don't have access.
Okay, but you can just drag it, for example, to the top of your screen or to the bottom.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop share screen though, because I don't have access to my cursor. I only have the right and left button.
Okay.
So I don't want to spend time on that today.
But you can stop share screen, move the bar, and then share screen again, for example.
Okay. How do I get to stop share screen without
just escape button again?
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah, I really apologize.
Just move the bar like somewhere where it doesn't bother you, like the very bottom or at the very top.
Got it. Okay. Very good.
And then you share again.
Okay, but that bar is on the share screen. Okay, I'm not going to spend time on this today. Okay, but very good. That worked. And now hit play. Okay. Oh, nope, it's there again. I'm not going to worry about it. So current events, as I go through this today, what we want to look at is the current, keep in the background, because this is what's, between the lines of Whitney's work, is the global socioeconomic, legal, and political interests, the rise of the medical military industrial complex, the global drug trade and prohibition, and the current US healthcare system. And then what I really got my attention was the heirs of the New York elite. Some of them are really strong humanitarians, and some of them are in federal prison. And so again, here we have, the same scenarios, but, some are do-gooders and some not so. What really struck me was the absence of any reference to the UFO UAP cover-up conspiracy. And yet, as I read, it's totally woven throughout in between the lines. It's just not something that Whitney Webb covered. Whoops. And then the current Trump New York trial and the US presidency, and then yesterday's news, which I'm not going to play the clip I had intended to, but it really brings the past and the present together. Okay, so I'm going to really just set the stage here as it's who the players are, some of the organizations, just to get us all on the right page of how complex this is. So Roy Cohn, his family owned the Bank of the United States, and he was a mentor to Donald Trump. So already we see the relationship, with the banking industry and New York real estate development. Roy Cohn was also, and I'll go into more of his background, but he was also an attorney for the elites. Harry Crown was a businessman, a major figure in Hilton Hotels, an investor in General Dynamics, and owner of the Empire State Building, and also involved in organized crime. Samuel Brofman was Seagram's Distilleries. Louis Rosenthal was Shenley's Distilleries during Prohibition. He was organized crime. Leslie Wexner was Epstein's financial manager. He's also the founder of the Limited Clothing Store. And again, I'm laying all of this out because it really is showing, how interwoven all of these things are between legitimate and criminal activity. And then I'll get into the intelligence part of it. Alan Acosta was Secretary of Labor during the Trump administration. And he disclosed to the Trump transition team that he signed off on Epstein's sweetheart deal because Epstein belonged to intelligence. And I believe it was both US and Israeli intelligence, and that he was operating as an agent between all the different scopes of practices that I had just pointed out. Robert and Betty Maxwell. Robert Maxwell is the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who was Epstein's co-conspirator. And also what, is not well known are the sisters, their twin sisters, Christine and Isabel, who were involved in software. And that's part of the next talk on this stolen software from the PROMIS software. Okay, key organized crime assets, and they're known as the social network of the National Crime Syndicate and Supermob, was Frank Costello. He was banking, money laundering. Lucky Luciana, an organizer of immigrant crime networks in New York City. It was the Italian, Jewish, and Irish criminal networks that mixed, and they were informally known as the National Crime Syndicate. There's the Supermob, which is a close-knit circle of Jewish and Italian mobsters and businessmen in Chicago, and a collaborative criminal network that intermingled with political power and legitimate commercial enterprises. And the acronyms, now this is, this is going to seem like a lot, but these are all the military intelligence that made up, this apparatus that mingled with the organized crime. So we have ONI, which is the Office of Naval Intelligence. It's the oldest of the intelligence agencies. There's the U.S. Information Agency, which is a covert group that was set up by the Eisenhower administration, and its purpose was for public propaganda during the Cold War. And then just this week, I came across this. This is a podcast, the Good Trouble podcast from May 15th. Currently in the DoD, the Pentagon is the Information Management and Perception Management Office, and it's for propaganda. It's managed by a former Army lieutenant who specialized in psychological warfare. And what was pointed out in this podcast is she is always in the background during the Aero press conferences. And this is getting into the UFO, UAP aspect of things. Then there's COI, Coordinator of Information. That was a clearinghouse for military propaganda before the CIA. It was a predecessor to OSS. OSS is the Office of Strategic Services that was established in 1942. That was a predecessor of the CIA. The CIA is the Central Intelligence Agency that was established in 1947. Then we have the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who recruited agents from those they busted. And then MCA, the Music Corporation of the Americas. And that's significant from a media perspective, is how the CIA used media to blend and distill propaganda. And again, there are parts of my presentation I cannot see, so I'm skipping those parts. So you literally are going to be reading between the lines of my presentation. So U.S. intelligence and law enforcement, the evolution. So all those agencies that I just outlined, I want to put it in a timeline perspective. So ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, was founded March 23rd, 1892. That's how far back we're going with this. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was founded July 26, 1908. And it was on domestic intelligence, and its principal function was law enforcement. And again, I have things on the right hand of my screen that's blocked out, so I can't read all of it. OSS was founded June 13th, 1942, and that was, around right before, it was during the war, World War II, and just before the Cold War. CIA was founded September 18th, 1947. Also, the U.S. Air Force was founded September 18th, 1947, and the Roswell UFO crash was July 8th, 1947. And again, Whitney Webb does not touch the UFO part of this, but it's just such an integral part of how I read her book that I will weave in bits and pieces of it. Then the National Security Agency, NSA, was founded November 4th, 1952. And that was actually a secret agency. It was kept from the public until the early 1960s. So there are currently 18 U.S. intelligence agencies that compete for funding for the national defense budget. And between each, there's covert and overt alliances and connections. So even with just within U.S. intelligence, there's a really complex, convoluted network. And I just wanted to bring this into perspective of, the U.S., is considered the largest, defense force in the world. And, this on the right is our budget. And I've seen various numbers, anywhere from 840 billion to 877. And it literally is a budget that's larger than the 10 next countries. What I found significant about this chart is Israel. Their defense budget isn't even on here. And so what that tells me, reading between the lines, that we're doing a lot of funding of Israel, and the U.S. and Israeli intelligence agencies are very intertwined. And I think that's really what Jeffrey Epstein was exposing. I mean, again, this is me reading between the lines, but and then also what's significant here, is that the U.S. doesn't have a national healthcare system, that we're putting money in defense, to protect our nation, and yet millions of people are dying, because they don't have healthcare. So how did we get, to that budget? There in April 14th, 1950, there was a policy paper called the NSC 68. It was drawn up by the National Security Council and it was presented to President Harry Truman, and it called for the expansion of the military defense budget. Even back then, the late 40s and early 1950s, the defense contracting companies were being infiltrated by organized crime. There was the Committee on Present Danger, the CPD. It was a pressure group set up during the Cold War, and they were the ones that basically wrote up this paper. And some of the organizers were Samuel Goldwyn, and he, if you know the movie productions, Goldwyn Mayer, and then also Ronald Reagan, who was an actor and former president. So already, back in 1950, we see the fusing of media, national intelligence, and propaganda. The Music Corporation of the Americas, known as MCA, it's an American media conglomerate that was founded in 1924. It was originally a talent agency with artists in the music business as clients. The company became a major force in the film industry and later expanded into television production. And what Whitney points out in her book, Epstein was a mathematical and musical prodigy in high school. And when he became, a teacher at the Dalton School, he was recruiting children basically that were musical prodigies. And I'll get into more of that. It may be that's really part of the second presentation. So what Whitney Webb does, she introduces Jeffrey in the beginning, but the whole second book, the whole volume, is about Epstein, the Maxwells, and how they were part of this criminal network. Okay, so OSS leadership. Now remember, it was founded in 1942, and it was viewed as a social club. The OSS was leadership made of the country's wealthy elite. The Mellon family of Pittsburgh, they were part of the Gulf oil fortune. And the most, well-known heir is Chris Mellon. He was former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. He's a private equity investor, and he's a very strong advocate for UAP disclosure. The DuPonts, they made their wealth through gunpowder, chemicals, the automotive industry, and Longwood Gardens, and they have 3,500 heirs. The Vanderbilts, they were shipping and railroads, and their well-known heir is the journalist Anderson Cooper. So there again, we've got the media coming in with this history. The Rockefellers were conspicuously absent. It's reported that Nelson Rockefeller headed his own agency, the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, and his brother David ran his own intelligence apparatus during the war. Now, I'm going to experiment here and hit the down arrow and see if, nope, it doesn't work. Okay, I was hoping I could clear my screen, but all of this is significant, and I'll be getting into more detail with this because it has to do with the KMT and the Green Gang of China. The KMT was the political party in China, and the Green Gang was basically the covert network. So again, looking at all these is the social political clubs. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there was the Claremont Club, the Thursday Club, the Georgetown Club, and this is where the elite met and mingled. And so the emergence of a private CIA. So within all of these legitimate agencies, what happens, and this is kind of fast forwarding to 1977, but when Jimmy Carter was elected president, he asked to be briefed on the UFOs. And the current director of the CIA was George H.W. Bush. And Bush told Carter that he would only brief him if he could remain a CIA director. Carter declined, and he replaced Bush with someone, Admiral Stanfield Turner, an old schoolmate and military career officer. And they changed the whole CIA culture. They were removing large parts of undercover and the special warfare operations, what, we would today call the black budget lines. So Bush, when he became a civilian, started a private CIA. and prior to becoming president in 1989. What's significant about this, I'll flesh out in the next slide, is that William Casey, who was CIA director, and I can't see this, but you can see the dates, overlaps with this. So just look at the dates, 1977 and 1989, and the overlap of William Casey's time during a CIA director of 1981 and 1987. So within the legitimate intelligence network of the CIA, there was also an informal intelligence apparatus that was known as the Hardy Boys. And it was made up of Casey's closest friends. And the group did not have CIA clearances, yet they had access to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Several members were charged with stock trading and money laundering, and others were part of a global network of shipping companies, banks, oil interest, and mines with ties to Israel and Palestine. There's a group, and what this next piece, I just want you to see these connections between, these organizations, the military intelligence and the presidency. So the Research Association International, RAI, the sole focus was the oil industry, and they had one exclusive client, a man named John Deuce. What's interesting here is during the Iran-Contra testimony by a man named Shackley, the name was deceptively spelled as DOIS. So this just shows, it's really hard to get to the truth when there's so much subtle deception. And this is where Whitney Webb has done a brilliant job of just, teasing through all of this and just bringing it to the reader's attention. And what I'm doing is just highlighting, pieces that caught my attention, and then what, I've read in between the lines. So with RAI, a former CIA officer on the payroll was William Barr, who provided legal services. William Barr was future Attorney General for Presidents George H.W. Bush and Donald Trump. And again, I just pointed out that Bush had been the prior CIA director and then went on to become president. And in between that time, he started to form private CIA. Okay, William Barr worked for the CIA from 1973 to 1977. Okay, and again, my screen's blocked out, so I'm just going to go from memory. But his father, Donald Barr, was an intelligence officer, and he was headmaster of the Dalton School, where Epstein taught, even though he did not have the credentials. And William Barr's, I believe it was his grandfather, I can't read it, but it was an economist and psychologist who served in OSS and during World War II. So again, you can see the transgenerational evolution of this really complex web. And what I want to keep highlighting, these are all good people, I think, with good intentions, and mixed in with those that don't have a moral imperative or a conscience. And it got really complicated. And so, I think our task in our generation is to start untangling some of this complexity, and which is what I'm trying to do. This is just my small contribution, to that project. So some of the projects and operations, and again, they were covert and overt. There was Operation X, which was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics personnel who were recruited into, that should be the OSS and CIA. Sorry, that's a typo. Operation Chaos is CIA's largest domestic and espionage operation with cooperation of the police department, law enforcement agencies. It was initiated during President Johnson's term in 1963 to 1965 to monitor the racial crisis and the anti-war movements. Project Artichoke, it built upon Project Bluebird. It was a special interrogation program with a focus on hypnotherapy, sensory deprivation, drugs, and psychological harassment. And all of this starts to weave into some of the government use of nuclear and psychological warfare. There's something called Operation Midnight Climax and MK Ultra. They were expanded programs of Artichoke and Bluebird. And what's important here is they used LSD, and the CIA was the largest consumer of LSD in the 1960s. They went over to Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland, where it was manufactured, and bought it all up. They then gave it to unsuspecting soldiers, patients in psych hospitals, prisoners, and private citizens. Whoops, I can't read this, but the CIA Security Research, Gaynord McCord, played an essential role in CIA's darkest projects. He was one of the, I believe it says the White House plumbers. Again, I can't see this. And was, I'll read what I can see, was arrested with a group of CIA-trained Cuban exiles. So what I'm going to go through this a little quickly, but what I'm offering is an insider's perspective, having been born into what we now call the military-industrial complex. And, I did my dissertation is on this. And the whole thing was written 2 years ago, and I've spent the last 2 years really trying to come to a conclusion. And finding Whitney's book last fall, it really, as I read it, my dissertation is all in between the lines of what she has written about. So I'm really bringing an insider's perspective to her work. And what I would say, and this is kind of the thesis of my dissertation, it's through the telling of personal narrative that relational resonance is found. And this is what I view as the essence of recovery. And one of the sayings, in the recovery movement is we are only sick as our secrets. And so what, Whitney has done and what I'm, bringing, my reflections to is this belief that we're only as sick as our secrets. And then Carl Jung has a phrase that individuation brings the world unto itself. And for me, it's just been uncanny as I've done my research, how everything, is just coming to me in the strangest ways. And so this is just one example. It's a book I read, and I can't read the title, but I know that it's Chaos, and it had to do with Charles Manson. And I think it was the CIA in the 60s, and the book was by Tom O'Neill. And when I read it, I put it down a moment of pause because the name George White came up, which was my father's name, and it's obviously not my father, but George White shows the overlap between OSS, the Federal Narcotics Bureau, and some of these, darker programs that the CIA was conducting. So OSS courted organized crime figures to bolster U.S. intelligence. George White was an agent of the Federal Narcotics Bureau who was recruited into OSS. And he infiltrated a drug smuggling operation in Seattle, Washington, masquerading as a drug dealer. And so again, I think the intentions were pure. They're trying to fight crime. And, here's, an employee of FNB. White's supervisor at FBM was Garland Williams, and he was attached to the CIA while, he was a supervisor at FBM. White was later recruited by Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist working with the CIA, who oversaw the research into potential truth drugs. This research led to shock therapy, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and esoteric mind work. Sidney Gottlieb's most famous project was MK Ultra, and the CIA and MK Ultra became the largest consumer of LSD. And as I said, it was used on soldiers, psychiatric patients, and inmates. So I'm going to just share a little bit about the Operation Midnight Climax and the UFO cover relationship. And this was based on, work that reading I did in my research, is the book I just mentioned, Chaos. And then also there's another book called The Day After Roswell, and it's a former Pentagon official reveals the UFO cover-up by Colonel Philip Corso. So after the war, White became a CIA contractor and served in FBM as a supervisor on Operation Midnight Climax, which was a sub-project of MK Ultra. It operated out of Greenwich Village in New York and also San Francisco in 1955. Prostitutes were hired to lure subjects into safe houses and then were unknowingly given LSD. So already we're starting to see the blackmail part of this coming in. And what I will say, the more I get into this, I think the sexual blackmail is really just a sidebar of all of this. The real issue is the financial crimes. And then what I'll get into in a much later presentation is the technological blackmail. White's alias during Operation Midnight Climax in Greenwich Village was Morgan, and I can't see this, I'm going by memory, but I believe it's Morgan Hall. John Gittinger was a Harvard psychologist on the CIA payroll and developer of the personality assessment scale. He testified to Congress that the CIA experiment was intended to observe the combination of drugs and sex. So here again is a very legitimate Harvard psychologist, developer of a tool I've used, in my work, who was part of, this MK Ultra project that has come under a lot of scrutiny. Now, this is unrelated, but I had a second experience, coming across the name George White, who was a totally different George White, who was an employee at NSA. And again, this is from the book, The Day After Roswell. He was an employee at NSA in the 1970s, who had the highest security clearance to deal with the alien bodies. And I know this sounds pretty bizarre for those of you who aren't familiar with it, but alien bodies that the NSA was working with. The Kryptos Conundrum, a novel by, again, I can't see this, I'm going by memory, but it's a novel by a CIA operative. The author was Brandon, and it was written in 2012. I was told about this book by a retired CIA person, John, I'm just going blank on this at the moment. But he joined a group I was in halfway through, and everybody was very thrilled because the CIA officer was giving us all this background information. And, with my background, I was a little skeptical or discerning as to why he was revealing all this to us. But I think he's done a real service to disclosure, and I think his heart's in the right place. But the Kryptos Conundrum, he recommended it, and I read it, and it's a novel, but, having grown up outside Washington, D.C. and within the military-industrial complex and knowing what I know about UFOs, there's a lot of truth in it, and it's a book I highly recommend reading. Okay, just briefly, my PhD research, the working title is UFOs in the National Security State, a Recovery and Individuation Process from Trauma Denied Within Culture. And I'm just this is just a piece of it. It's from pages 41 to 43 to give you, I'm sharing this to link, my life experience because, unfortunately, our session last Tuesday, kind of got hijacked with that due to the technological issues. But with this, formal presentation that will get very specific. And everything I've given you now is just really the background of the players so that you don't get lost in who's on first. So who will save your soul from lies that you tell is a quote that I start with. A sanctioned pathway of disclosure by the intelligent community has been the use of fiction and film, where discernment between truth and falsehood is left to the reader or viewer's discretion. And this is John Ramirez. He's the CIA former CIA person that joined a group that I'm in that shared that information with me. And before that, within my dissertation, I had read all these books and already cited them, but several literary examples are offered, how different disinformation and truth get fused with uncertainty and doubt. And, chaos, I mentioned Charles Manson, the CIA, and the secret history of the 60s, the fellowship. War Day is by Whitney Strieber, who's an experiencer of UFO abductions. Libra is a novel about the Kennedy assassination. Stranger to Strange Land and A Time for Love. I read that, in high school, trying to make sense of things. The Kryptos Conundrum is a novel by a former CIA operative that I mentioned. UFOs, the Griffiths Connection. My family was stationed at Griffiths Air Force Base in Rome, New York. And I just woke up one morning and the question was, I wonder if there's a connection between UFOs and Griffiths, and Googled it, and I found this book. So it's all there. It's all in plain sight when we look for it. We just have to be aware, you know, that this is lurking in the background. So let's see. So, you know, Stranger in a Strange Land, I mentioned I read in high school. The author is Heinlein. What's interesting is Heinlein graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in the class of 1929 and served in the Navy. His military experience influenced his writing, which blends fiction with ideas of societal relevance. A compilation of reviews says this of his work. Now, I really want to say this slowly, because as I went back through this, I just put this in here this morning because I know the relationship with my dissertation. And this last piece that I want to present on technological blackmail, Heinlein was writing about this back in the 60s. So Heinlein used science fiction as a way to explore provocative social and political ideas and to speculate about the interface between science and engineering that might reflect the future of politics, religion, sex, and I don't know what's underneath next. Within the framework of science fiction stories, Heinlein addressed certain social themes: the importance of individual liberty and self-reliance, which is so relevant in today's democratic culture, the nature of sexual relationships. This is the Epstein trial. And, you know, right now, former President Trump is on trial in New York. The obligation of individuals owe to their societies, the influence of, and this is the citizens' disclosure movement that Dr. Garrison and Danny Sheehan are involved in, the influence of organized religion on culture and government, and the tendency of society to repress nonconformist thought. He also speculated on the influence of space travel on human cultural practices. So this is, again, getting into the UFO cover-up. An example of Heinlein's creative weaving, and this is the part that kind of blew me away when I read this morning again, because I'm right in the process of, you know, preparing the second part of the Great Books presentation, which is scheduled for June, on the computer blackmail. So an example of Heinlein's creative weaving of computer technology, man's, I'm assuming, its search or quest to get to the moon and the politics of the time. In his book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and I can't read the date here, it's behind, but I think it was 1961. It's a book I have not read yet, but I, you know, as I went back over this, it's definitely one that I'm going to pick up. Algis Budry stated, I've never read a more believable computer character than, I think the name was Max. Carl Sagan wrote, the novel had useful suggestions for making a revolution in a computerized society. So I'm not going to go into this, but this is going to be relevant to the very last section of this work by Whitney Webb. For his own, and his words into inner musing suggest his writing may have been therapeutic or catharsis for his own inner tensions around secrecy and freedom. This is my thought. And again, this is part of my dissertation. So it's just a reflection that I had. Based on his words, he said, I began to sense faintly that secrecy is the keystone of all tyranny. Not force, but secrecy, censorship. When any government or any church undertakes to say you may not read this or you are forbidden to know that, the end result is tyranny, no matter how holy the motives. Little force is needed to control a man who has been hoodwinked. No amount of, and I can't read this, I'm sorry, it's blah, 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 blah. To conquer a free man, the most you can do is kill them. And I'm glad you can read that to fill in the blanks there. So this was, I'm not going to play this clip, but yesterday on the news, former FBI Director James Comey really got pulled into an investigation in 2016, right before the election where Trump was elected. And it was all based on the Clinton email scandal. And he was on the news yesterday, just getting his feelings on the Trump trial that's happening in New York on the hush money case with, you know, the porn star Stormy Daniels. And in the background, what was so significant to me, and I really encourage you to pull this up. If you have, you can take a screenshot, is there was a great big poster and it's, you know, had Trump's face on it and it said, the Trump Mafia. And then Comey goes on to say in this interview that the Oval Office was used as a social club. And I just pointed out the history, the elites, the social club, and politics, and also the use of media to influence propaganda and how important it is to stay on top of the narrative. So again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of this 7-minute clip, to link all this together. And then as part of my dissertation preparation, we did post papers, and I did mine on Trump as the collective shadow. I did one of the papers, Trump as a collective shadow of US culture, and that's on academia.edu if anybody's interested in that. So now we're going to get into it. Chapter 1, the underworld. Operation Underworld began in World War II. It involved the recruitment of high-level crime figures to work with U.S. intelligence to provide oversight of longshoremen on the New York waterfront. The Navy was concerned about foreign submarines on the eastern seaboard. ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, made a deal with Charles Lucky Luciano, who was in prison. His cell thus became a place for his criminal associates to coordinate counterintelligence activities. In the background of all this was the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, that was established in 1942 to conduct, well, we've already said that, the predecessor of the CIA. Many notorious intelligence operatives can be traced to OSS roots. E. Howard Hunt was of the Watergate scandal, John Siglob of Iran-Contra, and Paul Helliwell was the architect of the shadow banks. And I can't read the rest of that, but you can. So now I realize we are coming up on the hour, and I did ask Jim if I could just go, rather than opening up Q&A at noon, to go a little bit longer to get
Please do. Please
the
do.
details. And then I will stay in the after chat for an hour and a half and answer any questions anybody has. So if you can put your questions in the chat, Jim can look at them, and I will stop at like 20 after, and Jim and I can dialogue a little bit, just if there's any clarity, and then I will bring that into the after chat, which I really encourage you all to join. So we're going to jump over to China now, something known as Operation X and China's Green Gang. The Green Gang began as a secret society with roots in, and I always want to say Laoism, but it wasn't Laoism. It was based on the Buddhist mystic Luo Minhong, and it was a folk religion. In the 1700s, it became a powerful force with boatmen trading in grains. And this was, again, the beginning of the maritime industry getting involved in this mix of organized crime and intelligence. And it's also the beginning of religion, playing a part in this. The government suppressed the network and it went underground. They formed alliances in the smuggling world and became a powerful force in the world of crime. They financed activities through the cultivation and sale of opium, an activity fully sanctioned by KMT, the government they put into power. KMT, and I'll just have you read on your own, to gather political intelligence. The relationship between KMT and U.S. intelligence. Support for KMT opium monopoly came from Western internationalists such as the, I can't read it, Rockefeller Foundation, who set up an international health board, the IHP. So here's the beginning of a foreign global initiative, the global drug trade and healthcare, international healthcare, that I see has made its way into the current U.S. healthcare system. And I can't read the words, but something, it was the parent company to the China Medical Board. IHB supported China's Green Gang through the monopolization of opium for medicinal purposes. The goal was to consolidate drug refining to acquire sole access to opium coming into, I believe it was the United States, to seize and control the global drug trade. So again, I think this was a very up and up initiative that just happened to be infiltrated, with not so honest initiatives. After World War I, the League of Nations formed an advisory committee on traffic of opium, and they worked closely with the Rockefeller Foundation International Health Board. The intent was to consolidate drug distribution within select pharmaceutical corporations. I'm going to ask you to read the last line. Can't read it, but something, something, something to move CIA money. So I believe, and it was, I know there was a banking network set up, but I think it was also a legitimate business entity to move money. Opium is currency, and it was the China, Burma, India theater and the global drug trade. William R. Pierce, he was the head of OSS operations. In 1943, he said opium was the form of payment everybody used. It was a means of barter. Not to use it is a means of barter that would end our operation. Opium was available to agents to obtain information and to buy their, I can't read the word. The CIA became involved in opium and heroin trade to fund covert activities. And then Operation Paper is the CIA code name for operations that handled financial resources that supported the KMT harvest. And I can't read the last line. And what's occurring to me right now, this is so indicative of my life when I was privy to all of this, but I was missing the pieces. So I find it interesting. It's kind of a parallel process that at least you all have the information, but I can't see everything that's on my screen. The global drug trade is a massive business, and the offshore banking system enables it is even bigger. Massive amounts of capital from production of distribution of illicit drugs occupy a central place within the global economy. So Catherine Austin Fitts, I ran into her work a long time ago, and she really came under scrutiny. Everybody was trying to debunk her, who don't want they do not want the truth to come out because it benefits them. But she said there's a positive correlation between the upward trajectory of the stock market and the consistent ballooning of the drug trade. It may seem strange to think of a positive correlation between narcotics and the stock market, but consider the proceeds of crime need to find through legitimate legal channels. She also said if one further imagines that the banking system earns a fee of 1%, this flow then the profits for banks from illegal activity is $5 to $10 billion. And again, legitimate business, crossing the gray area for their own benefit, looking away, basically. Another avenue for laundering money is investment in real estate. I think who comes to mind. South Florida is a major refuge for Latin money that flows into the Florida banking and real estate systems. Proceeds from the drug trade were an important source for the cash-starved banks at the height of the 2008 economic crisis. And again, I can't read the quote, but the source, but you can read that. And so it's noon. Jim, can I go for another 15, 20 minutes? Because I think this is a pretty quick piece.
Yeah, please do.
Okay.
Please do.
So we're now going to go.
Your time.
Yeah, this is between the US and Canada, but also when you see the name Samuel Brofman, he's very closely tied with Israeli intelligence. And there's this whole thing between Israel and US intelligence and the Israeli and Palestinian war. Now that Jim's reading the book, I'm going to task him with unfleshing all of that because I don't have the background, but it's absolutely fascinating, the connections. What I'm going to do is give you the background that I understand that's feeding into the connection between US-Israel intelligence and the current war. So Samuel Brofman, his last name, interestingly, means whiskey man in Yiddish, rose to become Canada's business elite. His parents immigrated from modern-day Ukraine in 1889 due to the Russian anti-Semitic program. So here we have the Ukraine-Russian war showing up in real time today. He was the head of the Canadian Jewish Congress, I believe that says. During Prohibition, he found a loophole in legislation that allowed alcohol for medicinal purposes. He founded the Canadian Pure Drug Company, a wholesale ale mortar company that networked with U.S. distilleries and bootleggers that offered doctors a bonus for each liquor prescription purchased through a pharmacy service through Bronfenman. He created the whiskey Crown Royal to commemorate Queen Elizabeth's visit to Canada. And so we're bringing in the UK here, which is where the Maxwells lived. And Brofman Distilleries later purchased Seagram's and Son Distilleries, which became Seagram's. And I can't read the last line, so I will let you read that on your own. Louis Rosenthal, Teal, he founded Shenley Distributors in the US in 1933. He was part of an underworld consortium that brought liquor into the US, sold it during Prohibition. This is from House of Representatives testimony. Rosenthal had ties to organized crime. I think that was a typo. It's Rosenthal, and was the purchaser of Brofman liquors coming out of Canada. Brofman, again, I think was a legitimate businessman. He didn't share Rosenthal's obsession with blackmail and fraud, and a feud ensued. The Mega Group is a group of Jewish entrepreneurs that was co-founded by Charles Brofman and Leslie Wexner in 1991. And it was modeled after, and I'm gonna, I think I'm going by memory, but I think it was the Sanborn Group that was founded by millionaires and billionaires. And again, I think this is the beginning of the alliance between Canada, Israel, and the US. Something I want to mention, next time I will do a whole thing on Leslie Wexner. He is woven throughout volume 1 and volume 2. And for the life of me, I keep losing track of his place in all of this. And it's just an example of how slippery this information is. And I do have a whole piece I've done on him, but I cannot hold him in my consciousness. What is interesting, he is the founder of the limited clothing store, the retail clothing store that, the women in the US are very familiar with. So keep an eye on him when you read the books. He's an important player. So the Sanborn Institute, Rudolf Goldschmidt Sanborn was an oil executive. And if you realize earlier, I did mention the oil, where there was only one client that involved oil. So this is the piece that goes with that. And he was one president of the State of Israel Bond Drive. I don't know what that is, but in 1919, Rudolph visited Palestine. And again, it's blocked off in my, I think it was January to August. He was acting as the secretary to the Zionist Commission. So again, we have the Israeli US intelligence woven in here that really needs to be unpacked. There was a suspicious death, and in another talk, I'm going to get into the death of Danny Casalaro, who referred to this whole network as the octopus, and was going to write a book, The Octopus Murders. But here's an earlier murder that is very similar. Robertson was the first person who attempted to write a biography of Brofman. He traveled to New York to investigate both Brofman and Seagram's. I don't think Brofman was responsible for his death, but the fact that he was being investigated while in New York, Robertson concluded the book, and he telephoned a journalist friend in Canada, distraught. He claimed he had found out things about Brofman that they do not want me to write about. He called a second colleague, stating that his life had been threatened and that they would know who was doing the threatening, that he would do the job himself. He was found dying of barbiturate poisoning. His interviews were never published and remain unpublished, I believe that says. And then I'll let you read the rest of that. I do a whole nother piece. We're not going to get to it today, but Cohn and Trump. Trump was Cohn's protege. Roy Cohn and Donald Trump met in 1973. Trump was 23 years old. Cohn represented Trump and his father in a federal discrimination case of their New York apartments. Cohn later became Donald Trump's mentor. Cohn taught Trump to deny, delay, and distract. That was from a YouTube with Cohn's cousin. And his cousin goes on to say Cohn and Donald Trump has a symbiotic relationship. This YouTube was an interview, a conversation between Cohn's cousin and Michael Cohn, who just finished testifying in the current Trump trial. So you can really see how past and present are totally intertwined. And I believe it's the really old hidden trauma that's coming up to be healed. Other phrases Cohn used in the 1960s, Trump uses today, such as witch hunt, immigrants are animals. And Cohn resented the law and felt it did not apply to him. And that's from Whitney Webb's work. Some brief family history on Cohn. His father, Al Cohn, married a daughter of a wealthy Russian immigrant. And I can't see the first name, Marcus, in exchange for monies for a judgeship. Joseph Marcus founded the Bank of the U.S. It was the third largest bank in New York City. They were later charged with fraud. So here you're going to have the banking industry. Quote from the book, The Bronx and Brooklyn is where judges were made and political contributions arranged. Again, this is where my father and his brothers were raised, in the Bronx and Brooklyn. Al Cohn's wife, Dora, exhibited neurotic and sociopathic tendencies, which Roy's cousin claimed left a mark on their son. And then it's also speculated that Cohn had the same things. His doting mother created a person who thought he was free of the rules that you and I or most people play by. Roy played by his own set of rules. His darker side, he engaged in weaponization of the media and sexual blackmail. FBI file of over 4,000 pages. It's still not available to the public, which I think is interesting. And then here we have, I just went blank, the former director of the FBI, on the news yesterday, which I'm sure had access to this file. He was involved in illegal arms deals with Israeli intelligence during the same period as the Iran-Contra affair. Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover were arch enemies of the Kennedys. And so here the Kennedy assassination comes in. He died in 1986. He claimed he had cancer. His cousin said he died of AIDS. So Roy Cohn may also have been homosexual. I think I can finish Cohn. He was an attorney for the wealthy New York elites in New York and the mob. Also attorney for the mob. His clients included the Archdiocese in New York and the Trump family. He was considered the country's most influential political operator and New York City's preeminent manipulator, a one-man network of contacts. He admitted to blackmail, a blackmail operation targeting politicians with minors. Michael Cohen said Cohn had the Midas touch. And again, that's from the podcast with Cohn's cousin. And I'll let you read the bottom line, which I can't read. Roy Cohn was part of what is known as the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare. He was an anti-communist crusader, a close confidant of the FBI and legal counsel of some of the biggest names in organized crime. He used blackmail to navigate between legitimate businesses and criminal. An African-American juror he tried to get replaced lost her father in a car accident and had to be removed during one of his trials. He was Joseph McCarthy's right-hand man during the Red Scare, and that was the communist scare. He had Senator Joseph McCarthy blackmail high-profile individuals who were gay. McCarthy had an issue with booze, which made him a target for blackmail as well. And I can't read the bottom line, but I think it just talks about the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare. So sexual blackmail, the chickens and the bulls is that's a New York Police Department code name for prominent individuals who are homosexuals and thus were vulnerable to sexual blackmail. The targets included a Navy admiral, 2 generals, U.S. congressmen, an Ivy League professor, and actors. J. Edgar Hoover, as FBI director, was reluctant, and he had a long duration as FBI director, was reluctant to challenge organized crime due to his homosexual tendencies. He took the view that it was a local state issue during his 50 years as a prominent lawmaker. Cardinal Spellman, Archbishop of New York until his death in 1967 was, and again, I can't read something. Cohn's job was to run little boys. Say you had an admiral or a general, a congressman who did not want to go along with the plan. Cohn's job was to set them up, then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself. And at the bottom of the page is the source for that, which I don't have in memory. You could not get a job in New York without Cardinal Spellman's approval. He controlled everything. So here again is, the religious community playing into this. So I think I'll pause here. I think this is a good place to stop. And I'm just going to set it up for next time. So this is all about Israel, and very interesting. So I won't get into that, but Jim, I'm going to open it up with a conversation with you now, but maybe in between now and the next time I present, which is going to get into volume 2, where we're talking about the Maxwells who are in the UK. They have a very close connection, to the government there. The Maxwell daughters who were very involved with the PROMIS scandal. So I'll introduce that, and journalists that die. And then also there's a third piece to it. But maybe, Jim, you could do a piece on the Israeli-Palestinian connection with the war today before I do that. And then I'm just going to run through these files because I will pick up next time. And the pieces I have here I will share because it segues into volume 2. And then in volume 2, what we'll get into next time, the next time I present, it will be Jeffrey Epstein, Leslie Wexner, Ghislaine Maxwell, her sisters, her father. And then really a third presentation is going to be Epstein, Edge, and Big Tech, and the future of blackmail as technological blackmail. So as you can see, my ambition was to present technological blackmail in the second part of the grade books course 2, which is going to be held on June 11th. And I still will meet that intention. But in the interim, Jim asked me to do, these sessions for Humanity Rising. And so it's, I'm feeling it's a little bit rushed trying to flesh it out as clearly. But Jim, maybe, I'll stop share screening now. And I'm sorry to do this on public network, but I'd like to invite you to do a piece on from the book on chapter 3 on the state of Israel and the current U.S. or Israel-Palestinian war. And then I will pick up next time with, how that weaves into what I presented so far as a segue into volume 2. And I'm going to stop share screen now.
Good, thank you. Yeah, it's hard to take in the level of details that you're weaving together, and I think there's a danger in getting lost in the not being able to see the forest for the trees. And so that's where I want to, if you had to synthesize together in your own mind how you're holding all the material that Whitney Webb is bringing together in her book, what's the larger picture that you're holding within which all these details come together?
Thank you, Jim. That's a beautiful place to start because I've done a lot of reflection on what happened on Tuesday, and I trust, everything happens for reasons. I was really grateful for that. And so I'm going to go to the end punchline of all of this, and then I'm going to backtrack. The end of this is Jeffrey Epstein was intending to use technology to really pick up where Nazi Germany left off in Auschwitz. And so how I hold all of this, having come into this in the middle of the military-industrial complex and not having anyone to talk about bibliotherapy, was how I found a way to hold this until, I got into my own recovery. And this is what I was covering, really on Tuesday. When I picked up Whitney Webb's book, it's the next level of bibliotherapy that fills in all the blanks, of this really complex web. How I'm holding it. Okay, so with the bibliotherapy, the next step for me was positive thinking. let's just look away and, get on with life. And, what most of the world is doing, caring for family, a successful livelihood, and watching TV, listening to the media, all of the things that, we've been conditioned to do. And what, is needed is to start read these books and start connecting the dots between what Whitney Webb has done such an incredible job researching and your own personal experience of what you believe to be true. Because I really do believe that we all hold a piece of this, and we need to see how this relates to our own personal life and to start talking about it, which is, really what you're doing, Jim, here with Humanity Rising. We're having the conversations that need to be had. And this is probably, both you and Danny Sheehan have pointed out that the UFO conspiracy is the biggest conspiracy there's ever been. And what Whitney Webb has been pointing out is all of these other conspiracies, everything else that's gotten tucked into conspiracy theory. And so these two books are the precursor, as far as I'm concerned, to the UFO conspiracy. And I've spent my whole life making sense of this, and really my dissertation, which was written 2 years ago, and I just didn't know how to bring a conclusion to it. And, finding Whitney's books in the fall, I realized the reason I can't bring closure is I don't know how to link, what's been hidden with where this world we've been told is a certain way. I knew it wasn't. I've lived in both worlds since the age of 13, so, I'll just pause there because.
Yeah, I think we'll move into the after chat in a moment, but I think you're touching on something very important. The way that I hold it is understanding that you can perceive reality from the outside in, but also if you're disciplined and you're tenacious enough, you can get inside and look at reality from the inside out.
Exactly.
And this hit me when I was actually with 12 with the Kennedy assassination. I was a very young boy.
Yeah.
I was off in the island of Taiwan as the son of a missionary, and word came in that the president of the United States had been assassinated. And it was a shocking experience for me. And I just, in my little boy psyche, I thought, whoa, something really deep is happening inside the United States. And I kept studying it and learning, and it was years and years later that I realized that the forces you're describing back in 1962 were capable of taking out the president, covering it up so effectively that 75 years later, most people still don't know what happened with the Kennedy assassination, and killing at least a half a dozen people in the process of the cover-up. Everyone got away scot-free. And when I took that in, that this happened back in 1962, within 24 months of President Eisenhower in his farewell address warning the American people about the growing power of the military-industrial complex, one then gets a real existential sense of what we're actually dealing with in the United States of America, particularly 50 years on, where that group has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. So that now it controls both political parties, it controls the apparatus of government, and that's why the United States careens pell-mell off the cliff, not because the president is thinking strategically, he probably is, but he no longer has any capacity to stop the momentum of that military, industrial, intelligence, pharmaceutical,
Right.
mafia complex
Right.
that has been growing unchallenged for the last 75, 80 years in the United States. And I think that for me, when I take all that in, it helps me focus on the little bit that I can do as one of the light carriers, because I think that's all the choice that we have. We're either, as Eldridge Cleaver said, we're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution. And once you kind of get this is the reality, you get the real simple existential choice, right?
Right. Jim, I love that you brought that in. I have to say, I did email Jim at one point because the name Jim Garrison kept coming up. And I said, did you know that, that there was this, attorney, that did the Kennedy assassination? He said, oh yeah, you got to look at this video. And when I watched, I had seen it before, but I hadn't made the connection because, it was so long ago. But, you remind me when Kennedy was assassinated, I remember exactly, I was in second grade in Ursuline Academy in Great Falls, Montana. It was a Catholic school. And what you didn't mention is 1962 was also the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And then, my father, again, he was the missile launch officer during that. So again, I was totally oblivious to all of this. You were ahead of me because I was still, it was tragic, but I had no idea the implications of that, the Kennedy assassination, much less this whole thing with the military industrial complex. And, there were, really it's a naivety that I've come through that I see within the culture now that, we're all waking up to. And this is just the very beginning of the conversation that we're having.
Well, good. Well, Linda, bless your heart. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your exactitude. We'll take a break now, everyone, and Linda will join those of you who are interested in a deeper dialogue in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You received it on the Zoom reminder that you had. And then we'll have Linda back over the next several weeks as there's an opening in our schedule. But thank you, Linda. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, everyone, for your attention to something that's so complex. And it means a lot to me, to be able to share this with you, and again, it really is, Whitney, what she's done. It's such an academic. This is a one-year course, is the clip I shared, last week, the interviewer said, every college should be reading this, and my own personal experience. So it's really a gift that I'll be unpacking for the rest of my life. So thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.